All right, so in this lecture, we're going to be talking about absolutism in France and in Europe, and we're going to be talking about some of the foundations that were put in place during this time period. Now, the roots of the problems of state building in the 1600s go back to the turmoil of the Dark Ages, which helped give rise to two medieval institutions: feudalism. Oops, I crossed it out. I'm going to underline it. Feudalism and the medieval church. Now, feudalism formalized the fragmentation of France into some 300 different legal systems, and over the centuries, custom and tradition firmly established a multitude of local rights and privileges across France. Now, various nobles and local officials claimed these rights, privileges, and the offices that went with them as their patrimonial birthrights. Meanwhile, the chaos of the age helped make the medieval church a major factor in state and society. However, the revival of towns and the trade in the Middle Ages helped lead to the rise of kings, and they had always been recognized, in theory, as the rulers of France, but it had been centuries since anyone had taken them seriously. So, if we think about our system here in medieval Europe, feudalism created in a way, a social pyramid similar to this, where you had at the top and the bottom all these groups of people. At the top, we had what was known as the clergy. We often say in medieval society, those who pray are at the top here. Underneath the clergy were the nobles, those who fight. And finally, at the bottom were the peasants. What do peasants do? Those who work. The peasants included farmers, some merchants, some traders, but mostly farmers, and some artisans as well, included down in this area. These were a little higher on the list here, but peasants, farmers made up most of the money, and this was probably about 90 to 95% of the population. These guys up here making only about 10 to 5%, 5 to 10% of the population. So that's kind of the way feudalism. The way it works is your peasant works, and they give their food and their stuff to the nobles, the nobles give some certain things to the clergy. These guys up here pay no taxes, absolutely no taxes these guys pay, whereas these guys at the bottom get the grunt of the labor. Now, by the 1200s, kings were making serious claims to rule, in fact as well as name, strengthening those claims with the doctrine of divine rights of kings. Divine right of kings, which is rather important in this time period, the divine right of kings. However, they were continually clashing with the church and locally entrenched rights and privileges that had evolved during the Dark Ages. Now, in this time period, we have this disruption between kings and parliaments. And French courts, which is what the parliaments are, these are French courts, capital F. French courts were particularly troublesome in modifying, slowing down, or even stopping the king's decrees from being carried out. The king could appear before the parliaments and plead his case, but that was seen as being beneath the royal dignity and was rarely done. Now, this made it especially difficult for kings to get new taxes, which the inflation and high military costs of the 1500s made even more necessary. Kings had to resort to such fundraising techniques as taking out loans and selling offices and noble titles to ambitious members of the middle class. So the kings were broke, and they had to do some fundraising. I mean, we often think of kings as being like the richest bunch in the area, which is why they're kings, but they're really only kings because they're the strongest warriors. Now, the selling of offices and titles created even bigger problems, and taking loans as well. Kings repaid loans through tax farming, where creditors would collect the taxes of certain provinces, Naturally, these creditors would take everything they could get from the provinces, which bred widespread corruption and discontent in the absence of a professional bureaucracy to check these abuses. Now, selling offices and noble titles also bred corruption, not just with the king, but with the classes below. So corruption ran rampant as well, and made their owners tax exempt. Now, all this merely reduced the king's tax base even more, forcing him to sell more offices and tax farms, and so on, until he was so far in debt he could declare bankruptcy or imprison his creditors on charges of corruption in order to ease his debts. Now, by the mid 1500s, these financial problems, combined with growing religious turmoil and continual feudal separatism, which helped to trigger the French Wars of Religion. Now, which devastated France on and off for nearly 40 years. Now, one outcome of these wars was the willingness of people to recognize the king's power in order to ensure the peace. The new king, Henry IV, and his minister, Sully, used his new title favoring absolutism and various economic measures to restore the power of the monarchy. First of all, they repudiated foreign debt. So they dealt with this. They kind of went against it, while repaying French creditors at a much lower rate of interest. Second, they established the Pollet tax on hereditary offices that would partially make up for lost revenues when commoners bought into the tax-exempt ranks of the nobility. And third, they built and repaired roads and bridges to encourage internal trades. We call this infrastructure. Infrastructure. And finally, in the spirit of economic theory of the day, mercantilism was, which encouraged domestic industries to increase the flow of gold and silver into a country. And by the end of Henry's reign, the royal government was probably as financially solid as it has ever been. Now, Louis the Fourth's successor was a guy by the name of Louis, a king, it's not just a guy, but a king by the name of Louis the 13th. Louis the 13th. And his minister was Cardinal Richelieu, this guy right here. Cardinal Richelieu was his advisor, Cardinal Richelieu. And he continued building royal power. Now, they particularly focused on breaking the power of the nobles by destroying their castles, quickly crushing any of their conspiracies, and infringing on their privileges, such as dueling. They also excluded from royal loyal councils, relying more on middle-class officials who had just recently bought noble titles and were thus more reliable. So, middle-class officials. It's a rather new idea, getting the middle class involved in France. Now, by 1635, they felt France was strong enough to throw its weight into the 30 Years' War to stop Spain. Now, unfortunately, the war's expense largely wrecked the progress of the 35 years and forced Richelieu to resort increasingly on farm taxing, but this time with one important innovation. In order to protect the financiers who bought the tax farms, Richelieu created new officials known as intendants. Which actually in French is spelled the intendant system, intendants. Whose job was to report corruption and make sure the financiers got their money. Now, naturally, both the financiers and the intendants were quite unpopular and got involved in numerous disputes. However, Since the intendants were new officials with no tradition of being tried in local or church courts, all their cases went to the royal courts, which favored them and the king's interests. Now, eventually, Richelieu expanded the intendants' authority, making them supreme in all provincial affairs, and rearranging the provinces into 32 non feudal districts known as generalities. Generalities. Now, this neatly sidestepped the firmly entrenched interests of local authorities and eventually laid the foundations for more thorough royal control of the provinces in France under Louis XIV.